Heightened security sparks unrest around Jerusalem's holiest site. Are Israeli forces trying to push Palestinians out? I'm Imran Garza, and today's newsmaker is Al-Aqsa Mosque. About 2 weeks ago, Palestinian-Israeli gunmen killed 2 Israeli police officers near Al-Aqsa Mosque. That led Israel to shut down the entire site, cancelling Friday prayers and putting what critics say unfair restrictions on all Muslims who come to the area to pray. Metal detectors appeared to be the final straw. Violent protests have swept the area, with 3 Palestinians killed in clashes with police. Meanwhile, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas cut off diplomatic ties with Israel. And in the occupied West Bank, a Palestinian stabbed and killed 3 settlers inside their home. But Israel's government won't back down. Shoaib Hassan has more.
Clashes and an outpouring of rage across the Middle East after Israel restricted entry to one of the most revered sites in the world, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in occupied East Jerusalem. It happened after a deadly battle between armed Palestinian attackers and Israeli policemen on July the 14th. Since then, metal detectors and security cameras have been installed. Men under 50 have also been banned from going inside the mosque. Worshippers have prayed outside in protest. The compound houses Islam's third holiest site, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the dome of the rock shrine where Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. But its western perimeter houses the Wailing Wall, venerated by Jews who believe it is part of King Solomon's temple. Currently, only Muslims are allowed to pray inside the mosque compound. But many right-wing Israeli leaders have called for its annexation exclusively for Jews. That's why the exercise of greater control by the Israelis over the compound is viewed with great suspicion. Al-Aqsa has been under former Israeli occupation after the Israeli army captured East Jerusalem in 1967. But under an agreement, it's been managed by the Waqf Trust as a Muslim-controlled site. Since 1994, the trust has been under the guardianship of the Jordanian government after a peace treaty was reached with Israel. That means that any decision without taking the consent of the trust and the Jordanian government is seen as breaking the status quo.
Since the beginning of the events, I've held a series of meetings and evaluations with all security. We are making decisions accordingly. We are conducting this with composure, determination and responsibility, and we will keep doing so in order to preserve security.
That means many worshippers will continue to be prevented from praying inside the mosque. It's the first time that's happened since Ariel Sharon paid a visit in 2000. That incident led to the second Palestinian Intifada and the deaths of 6,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in the studio is Azam Tamimi. He's the chairman and editor-in-chief of Al-Hiwar TV channel and the author of the book Hamas, Unwritten Chapters. Also from the Turkish city of Bodrum is Richard Falk. He's the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. And joining us from West Jerusalem is Avi Bell. He's a law professor at Bar Ilan University. Gentlemen, thanks so much, all of you, for joining us. Avi Bell, if I can begin with you, sir. These security cameras and metal detectors, are they necessary even if they trigger another intifada?
Well, I think what we're looking at is the results of a terrorist attack of 10 days ago when 3 young men, Palestinians from northern Israel, used guns that had been placed there on the Temple Mount to carry out an attack on policemen, then ran back into the Temple Mount where they were ultimately shot. It's obvious that there have to be basic security measures like metal detectors and cameras. The Palestinian Authority has been resisting this kind of thing for a while. A year and a half ago, there was an agreement to place cameras there. The Palestinians foiled it after the Jordanians had agreed with Israel to do it and with the United States. And now the Palestinians are trying to escalate the situation by presenting this to people as if this is a restriction on access, when in fact what this is doing is maintaining a very favorable status quo to the Palestinians, where only Muslims are permitted to pray on the Temple Mount, and there is full and open access to the Muslims, but not to non-Muslims, including not to Jews.
Okay, so Azam Tamimi, that's pretty much in lockstep with what the Israeli government is saying. Our policemen were killed by Palestinian gunmen, and these are the security measures that we are taking, no more, no less, and the Palestinians are provoking. That's the perspective. Tell me why you disagree, Azam Tamimi.
Well, the root problem is occupation. Israel is an occupying power, and it has no legitimate right under international law to take any of the measures it has been taken. And even if there was an act of violence by a couple of individuals or by 3 or 4 individuals, that does not justify collective punishment. I think what's happening at the moment is that Israel is turning a purely political conflict into a religious conflict. You can resolve a political conflict, you can never resolve a religious conflict. This is seen as an attack on the first Qibla of the Muslims, on the third holiest place of worship for the Muslims, and it's provoking not just the Palestinians, it's provoking anger and rage among Muslims all over the world.
Okay, so let me then ask Richard Falk, which response from the other 2 gentlemen sounds more accurate to you? Is it the occupation being the root cause of the problem, or are the Palestinians provoking something here? Which one sounds more accurate?
The second response seems to me to be much more in keeping with the real situation, because one has to place what is happening in connection with Al-Aqsa with a wider Israeli effort to squeeze the Palestinians ever tighter. And this is not a fortuitous kind of development. It looks to me as if Israel was waiting for some kind of pretext in order to challenge this very fundamental holy site that is has so often been a flashpoint in the relations between occupying Israel and the Palestinian and Muslim resident population.
Okay.
I think it's very... just one other thing.
Sure.
I think it's very crucial to recognize the legal right of Jordan and the trust, as was mentioned in the introduction, to have control over any changes that are allegedly needed for the sake of security.
Okay, that's a good point. Certainly.
Argument is a pretext.
Okay, so let me ask Avi. Avi, the Waqf looks after Al-Aqsa compound, not because of a kind of benevolence from the state of Israel, but because this is an agreement, right? And so would you agree that they have the right to make those changes if changes need to be made?
Let me just preliminarily say one thing here. Both of your other guests today are on the record as supporters of the Hamas terrorist organization. Their perspective on this is not surprising, but it is something that your viewers ought to take into account when they're presenting their views. Now, regarding the Temple Mount, which, as has been mentioned both by, I believe, by Mr. Tamimi, it's the third holiest site for Muslims. It's also the holiest site in the world for Jews. It's the site of the ancient temples and the place where Jews consider it so holy that many of them will not walk on the Temple Mount. Now, the agreement that Israel has, a lot of this is a unilateral undertaking, but the agreement is quite favorable, as I said, to the Palestinians. And what it says is that the Waqf is in charge of administration, even though Israel retains security control. Now, that's been the case for 50 years. And the Palestinians, not the Israelis, the Palestinians have continuously tried to undermine this. It was the PLO that conducted excavations illegally on the mount in order to try to destroy Jewish antiquities. It is the Palestinian Authority that puts out propaganda about, anti-Semitic propaganda about the filthy feet of the Jews defiling the mount, and claiming all sorts of conspiracy theories about
Avi,
attempts to change things.
There's also the other side to the coin,
what we're looking
right?
at here...
Certainly, there's the other side to the coin. Ariel Sharon triggered an intifada in 2000 because he knew what he was doing.
No, there is no, that is not the...
Right?
No,
I mean,
no,
you're talking about provocations. There's two sides. We can play this game.
No, I'm not talking about provocation. I'm not talking about provocations. I'm talking about the agreement. The agreement is Israel's in charge of security and the Waqf is in charge of administration. The Waqf here is trying to take charge of security as well by saying that Israel cannot impose a very basic security measure outside, by the way, outside, not inside, outside the Temple Mount.
Right.
The Waqf at the same time is harassing Jews who come up to the Mount, not in order to pray, but simply in order to visit the holiest site in the world for them. And frankly, there is no provocation that justifies the kind of murder that we've seen. Last Friday, a Palestinian entered into the home of a Jewish family in Halamish and killed 3 people. He stabbed them to death.
Certainly.
He said he was doing it to defend the honor of Al-Aqsa following the
Avi, let me take that.
Palestinian
so let me take that, Avi.
And
Avi, in the interest of, let me take that
please.
and pose it to Azam Tamimi. Azam Tamimi, was that wrong? Will you condemn that?
What was wrong?
The stabbing of the family, whether they were settlers or not.
Israeli occupation is wrong. Israeli occupation is driving Palestinians mad. The Palestinians have had an experience with the Israelis that they always use such opportunities in order to confiscate mosques, in order to seize more land. 1994, a Jewish immigrant from America massacred Palestinian worshippers during the month of Ramadan in the Ibrahimi Mosque. And as a result of that, the Ibrahimi Mosque was taken from the Muslims and divided between the Muslims and the Jews.
So let's agree. The occupation is wrong. It's a military occupation recognized by the whole world. But was it wrong for this individual to go and stab?
Well, end occupation, there will be no violence.
Okay, so let me go to Avi. Avi, is it wrong to demolish this guy's family's home when they may have done nothing at all wrong? They may have nothing to do with the crime.
I think it's outrageous that your guest is trying to use words like occupation to justify murder. That's unacceptable. There is no such thing as a legal status that justifies murder.
Okay.
And it makes no difference whether...
Certainly, and you disagree with him, certainly. You call it murder, he sees it as a response to occupation. Let me ask you, is it wrong to demolish his family's home?
Do you not call it... I'm sorry, do you not call it murder?
I'm asking if it's wrong.
What do you call it? What do you call it? What do you call it when a gentleman goes into somebody's home?
I call it murder, yes.
Brings out a knife
I'm not debating
stabs
you.
3 people to death.
Yes, I call it murder. I'm asking you, is it wrong to demolish his family's home if they did nothing wrong?
Well, this is one of a set of punishments that are used in the world against assets of criminals.
Okay, so it's not wrong.
If you'll see, the United States, no, it's not. The United States uses more drastic measures for quite smaller crimes.
Okay, but we're
if you
talking
smoke
about
a marijuana cigarette.
Again, just like I told Azam.
No, I understand.
I told Azam not to talk about the Ibrahimi Mosque and rather talk about what I was asking him about. In the same way, I don't want you to talk about the United States. I asked you a very specific question about a specific incident.
You asked about punishments. You asked about punishments against assets.
Okay.
And I'm trying to explain what the international rules are about such things. Punishments against assets, against houses, against cars, against bank accounts are used increasingly throughout the world.
But you're saying international rules.
Europe.
While we're on the subject, can I then get you to accept that under international law, there's an Israeli occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem?
Israel applies voluntarily, it says, the rules of belligerent occupation to the West Bank. It does not recognize that there's a state of occupation in Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is part of the Israeli municipality. By the way, I should say that the result of that is that Palestinians enjoy more civil rights than they would under a regime of military administration and belligerent occupation.
Okay. Richard Falk, as we discuss this, it's not just politics, it's religion, it's geography, and beyond geography, especially with Jerusalem, it's a psychology. You've been following this for a long, long time. people disagree very fundamentally on the very nature of Jerusalem and what it means to them. We've heard it from the two guests. We've heard it for many, many years. With all of that in mind, as we stand right now in 2017, with the current provocations and the current trouble, how do we get out of this?
It's a very difficult question because there are lots of conflicting motivations that explain the emergence of this crisis. And I would say the dominant one is the effort of the Israeli government at this time, with the subtle encouragement of the Trump presidency, to push the Palestinians to the point of despair and desperation. This is part of a larger context that is making use of the inflammatory flashpoint that Al-Aqsa has been over the years. Even the Israeli security forces, Shin Bet, counseled against the imposition of these metal detectors and cameras. It's something that represents Israeli extremism and the reliance on state terrorism, which your guest in Israel overlooks consistently in his treatment of these issues. And that's the dominant source of violence in this context that we are discussing. And until that is confronted directly, one will have a recurrence of incidents and interactions of this sort.
Okay.
You cannot occupy a people for 50 years and violate international law and expect them to act like subdued, normal citizens.
Okay, so let me give Avi a chance to respond. Avi?
Well, your viewers, again, should know that Professor Falk is of the opinion that the United States is responsible for the terrorist attacks in September 11th, 2001. When he attributes all the Palestinian violence to a vast...
Okay, Avi, before you move on,
that is
Avi,
absolutely true.
For clarity,
you were
clarity,
condemned by
Avi,
the Secretary General. Yes.
Avi, for clarity, Richard Falk, are you a 9/11 truther or not? And then we can move on.
Well, it's a complete smear. I have never taken a position on 9/11 attacks.
Okay, so Avi, he says it's not a 9/11 truther. He says it's a smear. Can we move on? I don't want to talk about 9/11.
That is a complete lie. The
Secretary
General condemned him for it. But when he gives you stories about vast Israeli conspiracies that are responsible for Palestinian terrorist attacks, you should bear that in mind.
He spoke about state-sponsored terror. That's what he said. So I'm giving you a chance to respond. Go ahead.
He is trying to attribute Palestinian terrorism to some Israeli conspiracy, and I think that is inexcusable. What you're seeing today, when Fatah calls for a day of rage and calls for Palestinians to take to the streets and be violent, the group that is responsible for that is the group that issued the call. It's Fatah. When you see that the Palestinian Authority puts out repeated stories about alleged attacks on Al-Aqsa that are occurring by Jews simply walking on the ground, this is something that ought to offend our sensibilities. It's not something we ought to say then excuses acts of murder and violence. Professor Falk is trying to turn everything upside down, to create these conspiracy theories to excuse the inexcusable.
Okay.
And what we really need to see here is responsible voices coming to grips with the results of years of Palestinian policies to try to light up the situation
we're running out of time. Can I jump in?
Attacking Jews.
Can I jump in? Yeah,
sorry.
we're running out of time. So, Azam Tamimi, so we see on the ground, people are praying outside now. They refuse to go in, right? It's in protest. They don't want to go through these metal detectors. Very powerful images of them praying outside. Internationally, we've seen this story flare up. Internationally, we've seen people like President Erdogan of Turkey here saying the international community and the Muslim world need to do more. What do they need to do when they need to do more? What does that mean?
Well, if you talk about governments, there are several Arab and Muslim governments that have diplomatic relations with Israel and that provide some sort of a clout for Israeli measures. They need to threaten Israel with severing diplomatic ties, with some action, etc. But I think at the popular level, if Israeli provocations continue, we are going to see another intifada, a third intifada. And an intifada is not good news for Israel.
Mm-hmm. Is Richard Falk, is a third intifada good news for anyone?
Well, I think it's a natural development of this sense that Israel is pushing the Palestinians basically into a posture of either choosing resistance or surrender. And in that context, I would think, and the evidence is mounting, that the next phase of Palestinian resistance will be something that will resemble a third intifada. What shape it takes is hard to anticipate, and it depends a little bit on whether Israel decides that it's too dangerous to push the kind of policies that it has been and backs off. It's very hard to predict at this moment.
Okay, very finally, we are completely out of time, but Avi Bell, in the interest of fairness, the other two guests disagree with you on most things here. I want to give you the final word, but if you can, in 20 seconds, please, Avi.
The choices of the Palestinians are not resistance or surrender. They are coexistence or war. And I certainly hope that they will stop choosing war and start choosing coexistence.
Okay, Azam Tamimi, Richard Falk, and Avi Bell, it's been a pleasure having all of you on the program. Thank you very much. In a moment, we debate why the CIA stopped training rebels in Syria. And I speak with one of America's most famous and controversial doctors, Dr. Oz. Controversy surrounds the CIA's decision to drop a covert program that supports moderate rebels in Syria. Critics of the Trump administration say it's yet another move to appease Russia, one of Bashar al-Assad's only allies. But military officials deny the accusations, while some analysts say the decision was inevitable. Then U.S. President Barack Obama started the program 4 years ago. Since then, the CIA has trained thousands of rebels, but current and former White House officials say the aim was never to overthrow Assad, but to put pressure on him to accept a political solution. Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is David Mack. He's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. He's also a former U.S. ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. Ambassador Mack, thank you very much for joining us. So they called this Timber Sycamore, and it started under President Obama in 2013. Now it seems as if the CIA has abandoned it. Has it been done because of politics, to appease Russia?
No, it was done for a variety of reasons. Certainly, the unrealistic assumptions of the Trump administration, President Trump himself, regarding areas of cooperation from Russia has played a part in accelerating the end of the program. But this program has had problems from the very beginning. As you suggest in your startup of the program, it was never the objective of the United States to overthrow the Assad government militarily by using what was essentially a fairly modest program of covert support for Syrian rebels. We were always looking for reliable Syrian rebels, and those are very hard to find because reliability had to include both the ability to be effective fighters on the ground and to have policy objectives which were not too far off from the U.S. policy objectives of pressuring the Assad regime to enter into negotiations for a peaceful transition of power over a fairly long period of time. The Syrian rebel groups proved themselves to be either incompetent, sometimes even giving up their weapons in the field, or they proved themselves to have objectives that went far beyond what we wanted to see. And they were not interested in fighting against terrorists. They were interested in fighting against the regime. They wouldn't even tolerate the idea of Bashar al-Assad remaining in power
So
for a transitional period.
Let me then ask you about reliable rebels and use a very recent example. Idlib, it's been taken over by Al-Qaeda-linked and Al-Qaeda-laced rebels, and they knocked out Ahrar al-Sham, by all accounts, one of the more reliable groups out there. So isn't this just going to replicate itself throughout the country, where even if a group of rebels are somewhat reliable, and you might differ in terms of the interpretation, they're going to be replaced by Al-Qaeda or Daesh, ISIS. So you've got Assad and Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and that's the end of Syria, isn't it?
Well, Imran, you've used a great example of why this program was so cursed from the very beginning. These Syrian rebel groups that we were supporting almost inevitably entered into what they called tactical cooperation with elements like Jabhat al-Nusra, an al-Qaeda affiliate that is a deadly enemy of the United States. Moreover, as these Syrian rebel operations like Jabhat al-Nusra began to take in more and more Russians, or Chechens usually, and other people that represented, in the view of Moscow, a deadly threat, it had the effect of raising the motivation of the Russians to put actual Russian military forces into the theater, something that we were unwilling to do in Western Syria, although we have done so in Eastern Syria.
So if the United States is helping everybody else oust Daesh, right, and they're fighting them, and from time to time they also go after the Nusra Front and its various new incarnations as they rename themselves and rebrand themselves. So you have that taking place. So they're on the same page with the Russians and Assad and others on that issue. But on the other hand, whether you believe this wasn't done for Russia, it has still tipped the balance of power in favor of Russia and Iran and Assad. So what's going to happen now? I mean, you're just going to have the regime, and you're going to have extremist groups and the regime backed by the Russians and the Iranians forever and ever?
Well, you're quite right in saying that it's tipped the balance of power in favor of Russia. Not that that necessarily by itself would represent a deadly threat to U.S. interests. If the Russians want to pour a lot of money into Syria in order to protect their naval base at Tartus and an air base at Latakia, that's not a huge strategic problem for the United States. Whether it has increased Iranian influence over the long term is another question, because in fact the Russians have certain counter interests to those of Iran, and to the extent that the Russians have gotten involved, it has allowed the Bashar al-Assad regime, which is always trying to lessen its dependence on Iran, it's allowed the Bashar al-Assad regime to be somewhat less dependent upon Iran and Iran's affiliate, the Shiite Hezbollah, which is another terrorist organization that the United States does not want to see strengthened in this contest.
All things considered, when we look at President Trump, when we look at National Security Advisor McMaster, when we look at CIA Director Pompeo, when we look at General Mattis, on Syria, do they know what they're doing?
Well, I'm afraid that they enter with some unfortunate assumptions regarding the Russian objectives. And we've always underestimated the Russians' willingness to take a huge and for them, very expensive gamble in putting their limited military and economic assets to work in Syria. In eastern Syria, on the other hand, where the fight is clearly against Daesh, and where the United States has put in very substantial military forces, as well as providing some significant weaponry to Syrian rebel forces, I think that the Trump administration, like the Obama administration before it, will be able to say that it is fighting against this so-called Islamic State and likely to win some important victories over it.
Is there a clear policy?
Oh, no. And certainly from a Syrian perspective, I would say, well, all very fine for Washington and Moscow to say that they've eliminated some terrorist groups that might have enemies of the United States and Russia in them, but our principal enemy was Bashar al-Assad. We can never have peace in Syria without the end of that regime. And the Syrian rebels have a very substantial point there. I don't think there ever will be peace in Syria without Bashar al-Assad going off to his reward somewhere. And whether the Russians will ever cooperate in making that happen is another question. But their attachment is not to Bashar al-Assad and his regime. Their attachment is to their own interests in the country.
Ambassador David Mack, it's been good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us. When Dr. Mehmet Oz first appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show more than a decade ago, he was a relatively unknown Turkish-American heart surgeon. But his appearances soon became regular segments, which catapulted him into his own daily medical program. Now, Dr. Oz, as he's most commonly known, is a household name and a brand worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But Oz's success story is not without controversy. He was brought before a U.S. Senate committee on weight loss scams and criticized for promoting alternative medicines that he calls miracles, but that many medical professionals call pseudoscience. I caught up with Dr. Oz here in Istanbul, and we discussed his success and the accusations that have dogged his illustrious career. Dr. Mehmet Oz, thank you very much for joining the program. Good to talk to you. It's an honor. You know, I do a show that probably has like 0.1% of the viewership that you have. We're trying to grow it. Maybe this appearance would help it grow. But every day we ask ourselves, what do the viewers want? What do they want? Do they want people crashing into each other? Do they want me to hold people to account? Do they want just sort of like honest, brutal journalism? Do they want to just be informed on a deep level? Now, you do a show that reaches, I guess, on average, what, 3 million people?
Yeah.
What do they want?
What most of us want, and as a consumer, I'll say this because I watch the programs as well, is the truth. You can be hard-hitting and a jerk and not be honest. You can be soft and dishonest, but you can also do both of those in an honest way. So when I look at our viewership, our program airs in over 100 countries. We have probably 15 million viewers over the course of a week. So I have to speak to very different people about what's going on in their lives, and I have to meet them where they are. That doesn't always happen by chance. You have to actually spend a little time trying to figure out what are the big pain points that hold people back. So when I study these issues, I realize that there's some problems, for example, around weight. There are problems around energy. If you Google in "why am I" into your Google browser, the first thing it'll put in there, it'll autofill "so tired," exhausted. It's asking why I'm worn out, because we live in a world where people feel that way. But there are other topics that I feel compelled to get into. I think there's a lot of health and science in crime, which is a crazily popular space because everyone can have their own opinion about whether OJ, who was just released, was guilty or not. So when I have Golden's family on, which I just did, and talking to them about what happened the night that he was accused of killing his wife, ex-wife, and her new boyfriend, or what happened subsequently to put him in jail, you begin to get a different scientific understanding of what happened that can educate you in any conversations you're having. So I don't have to stay just in my health sphere. And in general, when people watch us right now, what they're primarily looking for is where I'm willing to tell the truth, where others may not be brave enough to do that. Am I willing to challenge the orthodoxy of big food, because I think we're being fed foods that aren't in our best interest, or challenge your belief system about sugar versus fat and which one you should be eating.
Right.
Or frankly, what kind of diet's best for you if you want to lose weight. All those are places where there's lots of politics going on, even though it's all in the health space, and where having someone put their neck on the line and take a chance is worthwhile.
And I want to revisit what people want and whether you have to kind of make that compromise between what is kind of empirical and what the majority want, right? But big picture, someone like Carl Sagan took, say, astrophysics and popularized it. Now you have people like Neil deGrasse Tyson. They take scientific concepts and they appeal to mass audiences. Is that how you see yourself when it comes to medicine?
Both of those are names you mentioned are people that I admire. There's, billions and billions was Carl Sagan's great line. And growing up, most of us in the scientific community who thought we might want to be scientists aspired to be able to do what he did, which is to take something that is so important and make it cool enough that you'd learn it. Neil deGrasse Tyson's done a wonderful job taking it to the next level as well, with ideas that can be complex to understand, but are eminently comprehensible if done correctly. So I'd like to think that I am doing what they have done, but in the health space. I also recognize that health's not just an abstract concept. Health is about a very intimate part of who you are and who you will be, and will dramatically affect the people who you love and your ability to spend time with them, quality time in particular. So it gets into a much more political environment pretty quickly. So when I say political, I'm not talking about Republicans, Democrats, or opposing conservative liberal parties. I'm talking about the reality of how we give advice to people and who should be allowed to do it. The big battle right now is the role of doctors in this process. And as a physician, I'm very proud of my heritage. I'm proud of what I was taught to do. I still practice medicine 1 day a week. I also recognize that I don't have the ability, the tools to give advice as a doctor in an office to everybody who comes in at the level they need to hear it. So I feel strongly that education on television, online, and new technologies, and our phones in particular, should be allowed to educate us and customize their advice to us based on what we need the most. So if I'm a diabetic who has the ability to lose weight and therefore can get rid of my diabetes, which will happen in many people if they do lose their weight, then I'll be able to sort of dance the process. So I want to go ahead and take some chances and push and nudge and lobby for the right things to happen. Great example is sugar in our diet. There's a lot of money behind selling sugar. But more importantly, the money's not just because people making sugar, it's because products are bought that have sugar in them. So we manufacture products with lots of sugar, and then we subsidize sugar, so it's cheaper than it should be. So these are all things that I want to call people's attention to. You can decide in your own mind, because you vote with your pocket 3 times a day, not to eat sugar. You can lobby your governments to make sure sugar is not as readily added to all kinds of stuff, or at least tell us that it's in there. But if you have the choice, you can, at some level in this process, intervene.
You say big sugar. I mean, people know that it's something that's killing people across the United States and everywhere, especially in the developing world as well, right?
Big problem.
As you have a little bit of abundance, these corporations come in and people are killing themselves with their sweet tooth. Big sugar, big pharma, is it the same thing in your opinion?
No, they're slightly different. There's a clear health benefit to some of the drugs that are made by pharma. Whether we need all these medications and the amounts we take them, that's a whole separate issue. But I feel that there's an appropriate respect that we should give pharma for developing drugs that do change mankind's destiny. Sugar is a little different. Sugar in a natural form is a completely reasonable thing to eat, a piece of fruit. It comes with fiber, it's perfectly proportioned, your body sucks it into its bloodstream at the level it should be sucking it into. Your insulin levels don't get pushed around because of it, your hormones therefore can stay stable. So within reason, it's perfectly fine. But if I'm adding sugar to ketchup to make you eat more of it, separate issue.
Does the consensus on health change too much, depending on who holds the levers?
The consensus on health changes because we publicize controversial articles. If I were to publish yet another article saying sugar is a problem, you wouldn't bother paying attention to it because you already know that from yesterday's article. But if I write an article saying sugar and cigarettes together save your life, you're all over that because you think that's sort of cool to understand. So one of the beauties of health is that it continues to change. Lots of investigations are being done. Unfortunately, it also means there's a very rocky road as people go left and right, up and down, trying to figure out what's the best health for them. That's why my belief is that over the next 2 to 3 years, especially with advancing artificial intelligence insights about your health, your personal health, and the ability to customize to you specifically, we're going to be able to advance the ball. So you'll be able to look on your phone and say, you know what, for you specifically, here's what you need to do. And here's advice from 3 people who are knowledgeable in your problem. Pick the one you like. But these ideas over here, they're not right for you because you're not a 24-year-old athlete, you're not a 75-year-old grandmother, you're right in the middle.
And you've said you've tried to push the boundaries, you've tried to be different. In hindsight, do you regret that, given that it got you in trouble a few years ago?
No, I don't regret the decisions I made because I don't think I'd be worth having a show if I didn't make those decisions. I remember having long, detailed conversations with the people I trust the most in this area. It was always the same feedback. Do what you know is right. People will come around eventually. But if you don't do what you know is right, then even if they do come around, or if they're kind to you initially, it doesn't matter. People, will sometimes love you, sometimes they'll like you, sometimes they dislike you, but if they respect you, you're in the right spot. And I feel that in the media space, that's what we crave the most, to be respected, to count. And then people at least pay attention to what you're offering. Now you have to be respectful to them. You've got to share information with them that makes difference. You've got to get it right. You can't be perfect, but as much as possible. But if you're not brave enough to say what you really think is happening, there's no point in being involved in this business.
But if I put it to you this way and I say, well, you know, you're a world-renowned heart surgeon, you teach, you're credentialed to the ends of the earth, you're one of the smartest people around, you're America's doctor, you still perform surgery on Thursdays,
yes,
as far as I understand,
that's right? Yes.
So you have all of this, and people see you as a don and a guru. Is it worth throwing this reputation away for, what was it, raspberry ketones or whatever it was that you had endorsed that got the Senate to haul you in? Was it worth it?
Oh, for sure, because I never endorsed it. I never sold anything.
Right.
That's the interesting saga that we live in the modern world is it's very hard to really figure out what you think is true. Because oftentimes you're being served information that's in itself questionable. I never sold a product, period, ever. Raspberry ketones or anything else. And right now, if you go online, you'll see my name associated with all kinds of creams. They're on the creams these days. The irony of information transfer is that it is perfectly legal in most countries to lie about what people are doing, and specifically what they're selling. So all these celebrities now are falsely seen as endorsing products that they've never been involved with, literally, never knew the thing existed even. And then unscrupulous people will take advantage of innocent bystanders, get them to buy products, make a lot of money, and it's still not illegal. When I say illegal, I mean, there's no criminal problems. And it actually was the first step to what ultimately became the fake news phenomenon. Because fake news is not about politics, I don't think. Fake news is about money. People write politically charged information in order to get people to click, and the clickbait then leads them to buy products. Because, you know, I can be a legitimate manufacturer of a shoe. I can say, hey, get people to come to my website. You read a fake article to get people to click. They end up on my shoe website. I can sell you a shoe. Or even I can sell you an unscrupulous product like raspberry ketones or whatever. And completely fake, by the way. There's nothing in the actual products usually. There's not even, forget about the fact that they're using my name illegally or that they're lying about my association. The stuff that they're selling is actually fake. And sometimes there are things that can be dangerous in there. So it's your health that I'm actually concerned about more than a little bit of reputational blister for me. But unless we get ahead of these things, we're going to run into more and more problems. And this is an existential crisis. The web is primarily protected by a series of laws written in the 1990s, at which time it was believed that the web was basically a billboard. Think about this. If I'm a billboard, how can I blame the billboard guy for someone sticking a little poster on there about child slavery? Right now in America, there's a thriving business in not just pornography, but child slaves who are sold for sex. Completely legal. Completely legal. When I say that, it's not like they were sued and they were able to, they were sued and won over and over again. And you may say, well, why hasn't someone passed a law to stop that? It's because the biggest companies in the world involved in digital trade are lobbying actively to prevent the US Congress, and I'm sure it's happening in other countries as well, from passing laws that would make it illegal. We still have this belief that the web should be a billboard, but it's not. I'm being served most of my news on Facebook. So why would they be exempt from rules that govern other media outlets? You can't falsely claim I did something on this show, right? You can't. And a newspaper that's partnered with you couldn't do that, but your website could and get away with it.
Talking about fake news, somebody who loves to use the term, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, you gave him a bit of a health check when he was a candidate. How important was that for the public to know his health and the fact that he was a little bit overweight, and you very kindly, gently gave him that advice?
I think it was vitally important. It was a time in the election cycle when health was a big issue. I invited both candidates on. They both accepted. And interestingly, when Secretary Clinton got ill, she withdrew. But it wasn't clear to most people what had gone on with her health. Whereas at the time, candidate Trump very quickly jumped on the opportunity, because he'd already been invited, to appear and defend his own health. I remember getting asked the question the next morning on the Today Show about whether it was the right thing to do, to have a candidate explain their health on a television show. And I thought, well, of course, why not? Why wouldn't I want to go on myself if I'm a candidate and defend my health with my records? It's my body. Why would I let some newspaper write their version of my health based on my medical records? So I'm proud that we did it. I would do it again. I would continue to invite candidates on, especially if health is an issue. Not that I want to pry into their personal issues, but if we have two candidates who are older, and both their candidates are around 70, and they're both making an issue of the other person's health, why not have them come on and defend themselves? It seems like the perfect forum for a television show. You take out the middleman.
Taking that further, should a candidate have a psychiatric evaluation before they run?
Well, it gets into a little bit of a debate about what's normal and not normal. I would offer the suggestion that many people who are willing to put their life on the line to run for politics have a little something off, and they obviously are driven by big driving forces that might make the traditional psychiatric evaluation a little less important. But this, he'd had a full medical checkup, so had Secretary Clinton. They were both released ultimately, both of which seemed to check out. So I think in the case of the U.S. election in 2016, the health of the candidates was not a major factor.
You're America's doctor. What are you to Turkey?
A proud son of this country, a citizen of Turkey. I'm a joint citizen of the U.S. and Turkey. I did my military service here. I'm very proud of the fact that my parents live here. My whole family pretty much is here. And my father, who lives about 2 miles down on the Bosphorus from where we are, gets up every morning and talks about how this country made him who he is. A poor kid was able to get educated on scholarship, but was sent to the U.S. to learn, and is immensely proud of the remarkable advances that have occurred in this nation. If you think about the year he was born in, 1925, Turkey at that time had only 2 or 3 years earlier reconvened itself into a country. It had been torn apart after the First World War. And he grew up in the Depression. And in the 30s, Turkey was a very, very poor place to be.
Right.
And this area where we're sitting, which is where Ataturk lived, what is very important in this country, because he was able to give hope when there wasn't much else you could give. And then they survived the Second World War. My father's generation died in the war. And they've been able to pull it together. You look around now and see a country whose economy is dramatically increasing in size. They're delving into numerous different areas of commerce. Their airline goes to 120 countries, the most of any airline in the world. They're becoming the major portal for people to talk to each other. And I would offer that if you don't understand this city that we're sitting in, Istanbul, it's very hard to understand the world. Think about this. The Roman Empire didn't really just collapse and go away. The Roman Empire moved to Istanbul, in Byzantium, and for over 1,000 years carried the torch of Western civilization. When Europe was suffering through the Dark Ages and Islamic literature was still thriving for part of that period, but collapsed subsequent. So all these things are happening in the world, but this city kept it alive. And when Fatih Sultan Mehmet, my namesake, took the city in 1453 and made it an Islamic city, it continued to thrive as a meritocracy, as a place where people from all different religions and countries could come and live. The whole section around Galitukule, around the sort of the Venetian part of the city, was able, Jews and Greeks and Christians and Muslims, East and West, North and South, you could all come together, and you were allowed to thrive as long as you had business, as long as you had something that kept you going. And yet we live in a world where we forget that there are bridges that allow us to come together. And as a Turk, I'm proud of the fact that Turkey could be one of those bridges.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I fully understood Turkish politics, or I don't quite, but I understood it a bit more when I read John Freely's history of the city. He's a Boğaziçi late professor, from the time when it was a Greek fishing village and until now, right?
Well,
shaped by its geography.
You mentioned Bosphorus. You know what the real meaning of Bosphorus is? I mean, you probably
tell me.
Oxford.
Right.
Oxford. This waterway behind us was probably a stream until the Gibraltar was breached.
Right.
The Atlantic Ocean filled the Mediterranean Sea, lake, making it into a sea, and then rapidly drove up the water level here. And many argue that the search for the Golden Fleece was actually the Black Sea, because every year there'd be a couple 100 feet of advanced water as the water filled this part of the world. So this is an important place for us to understand. There are a couple. It's not just Turkey and Istanbul. I don't think you can understand the world if you don't understand India. Yeah. There are different parts of the world I think is so vital to us to appreciate, because so much of our heritage came from there. But we forget that, especially if we haven't traveled that much.
You spoke of heritage. You spoke of people of different faiths. Something that's interesting about the Muslim world is that, if I give you a soccer example, nobody cares about Lionel Messi's faith in many ways. But if Paul Pogba is seen at the Hajj, or gone for Umrah in Mecca, suddenly it's like, oh my God, Paul Pogba's a Muslim, oh, he's one of us, you know. And a little bit of that has happened with you now, you know, so he's a Muslim. He represents us. We're proud of him. Does that irritate you, or is it something you take on?
No, I take it on. I think Islam has a huge opportunity and an obligation to explain what it's really about. It's too easily characterized as people blowing things up, motivated by hate, and doesn't really reflect the religion I grew up with. I grew up learning Islam from my grandmother, who was born before the First World War, had a very deep faith and a humbleness that went along with it. And my uncle, who actually was an iconic figure in the engineering world in Turkey, because he was actually sent to train in Germany. He lived under Hitler in Germany as a Turk, which wasn't such a party either, but brought back to Turkey wisdom in 1944 when he was allowed to return. That helped educate a generation of engineers, and Turkey has thrived, I think, because of some of those teachings. And both of them, again, a very learned man and a woman who had really not learned to read. And she had, you know, they were able to pull together and make it work. And both of them had a religion as their foundation, their faith.
So are you a conduit of civilizations and ideas?
If I had to pick one role that I'd like to be known for having when this party on earth is done, it's as someone who's able to bridge people together, opening their eyes to the wonderful reality that was out there if they get past their fears. And I'll quote the great philosopher Frank Zappa. He said, you know, a mind is like a parachute. Works a lot better when it's open.
Dr. Mehmet Oz, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Next time we debate whether Hezbollah is operating in Venezuela. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.